Everyone knows Crash Bandicoot games are not easy, but I've been playing as this orange rat for 20 years now, so beating any game in the series doesn't take me more than a few hours. I needed a new challenge, so this past year, I decided to 100% every entry in the series. I spent dozens of hours grinding away on time trials and breaking every box these games could throw at me. With all that pain Crash has caused fresh on my mind, I'm going to rank every Crash game by how difficult it is to complete. To clarify some rules for this ranking, I will only be looking at the 11 mainline Crash games, so no kart racers or spin-offs. And Crash of the Titans is definitely a spin-off. I have never played any of those games and refuse to acknowledge them. I will be ranking them based off how hard it is to get the maximum percentage or the platinum trophy, but not every last thing in the game. If you only need gold relics to reach the max percent, I don't care about how hard the platinum time relics are. I'll also be separating the original PS1 games from their Insane Trilogy counterparts, because I think the addition of time trials and DLC levels make a difference in their difficulty. Lastly, these are all my opinions. I've definitely played some games more than others over the years, so I might find them easier or harder than you would. If you think I'm horribly off base, just let me know in the comments. Whoa! Crash Twinsanity. I was surprised when this was at the bottom, but it made sense when I considered what it means to complete a Crash game. Twinsanity is the only game on this list where you don't have to break every box for completion. Instead, it's an open world style game where you explore to collect gems, more similar to something like Mario Odyssey than a traditional Crash game. Getting 100% here isn't much harder than beating it without collecting anything, so don't be surprised that I find the Game Boy games more of a challenge. The final level, Ant Agony, is definitely the hardest part in the game, but there's nothing there that should take more than a couple tries. Now, if we were trying to beat this game without running into a glitch, it would have topped the list. Whoa! Crash Bandicoot The Huge Adventure was the first handheld title in the series, and due to the limitations of the Game Boy, Crash was transitioned into a pure 2D platformer. I was debating whether or not to include the handheld titles, and decided that this and Entrance definitely felt at home with the rest of the series, maybe even more than Twinsanity. So I included them in the ranking while leaving the mini-game collection of Crash Purple out. The Huge Adventure takes after Crash Warp, with the inclusion of time trials on every level. When you mix that with riding segments where you can barely see what's coming, it's very easy to get frustrated. To get full completion, you need at least gold relics here, but this game has some of the easiest requirements in the series. Getting all the boxes isn't too painful for any level, so that, and the mostly simple design, keeps this as one of the easier Crash titles. Whoa! Coming in at number 9 is the Wrath of Cortex, which is only barely harder than the Huge Adventure. This is the only game in the series where Sapphire relics count for full completion. That means you just need to reach the base time, which can easily be done as long as you don't stop moving during the level. The only reason I put this game higher up is because the last few levels do provide a decent challenge that isn't really seen in the previous two games. There were a couple time trials that took me more than 5 attempts, so the game isn't a cakewalk the whole time. I especially hated any time these rotating platforms were included, because I can never get the timing right. This is my least favorite Crash game though, so maybe it just feels harder because I'm bored while playing these levels. And this game is boring. There's a kart race that is literally beaten by doing nothing, so of course this wasn't making it very high on the list. Whoa! Crash Bandicoot 2 is the first entry on this list that I would call difficult. I think anyone could beat the previous games mentioned, but the original Crash Bandicoot trilogy is not to be taken lightly. Growing up, this was probably my favorite game in the series, but it was still infuriating to play sometimes. I definitely never fully completed it, because how is a kid supposed to figure out all of these secret exits? And the levels hidden way behind them are some of the hardest in the game. I love trying to keep up with the light and Totally Fly. The clever placement of steel crates forces you to play in the dark and blindly jump over pits if you want to get every box. Death routes were introduced in this game as an alternative to beating each level without dying from the original. These routes are usually harder than the rest of the level, and it gives you a chance to prove your skill. But if you don't bring enough lives, it can easily lead you to a game over. This game has a handful of long backtracking sections if you're trying to get every box, and these can be annoying if you don't plan your checkpoints out properly. Altogether, Cortex Strikes Back is a much smoother experience than the first game, and time trials haven't been introduced to the series yet, so all you need for completion is to get every gem. The game can be tough at times, but all that makes it the easiest of the trilogy for me. Whoa! Okay, How could a Game Boy title possibly be harder than an original Crash Bandicoot game? Easy. By requiring Platinum Relics to get 101%. Crash Bandicoot Entranced is a really fun experience on the go, absolutely ruined by Platinum Relics. None of the platforming levels here are particularly hard, so getting every box is no problem. But needing Platinum times makes this game way harder than the Huge Adventure, despite feeling mostly the same in gameplay. I was able to get most relics in a few tries, but I found the Atlas levels to be the hardest thing in the game. Getting a Platinum on these, you have to rush in recklessly and hope you don't hit a Nitro on the way. Turning at top speed is near impossible, so you have to memorize the course and know when to slow down, or you go barreling out of bounds and have to start all over. It would take me over 30 minutes just to beat one of these, and I will probably never 100% this game again just because of the Atlas sphere. Honestly, a lot of this game is really fun and definitely worth checking out, especially the bosses, but completing it is not worth the challenge due to those time trials. Whoa! Speaking of time trials, let's go back to their origin. Crash Bandicoot Warped made these a staple for the series, and they are undoubtedly the hardest part of this game too. I think the levels in Warped are on the easier side for the original trilogy, but time trials definitely make it harder than Cortex Strikes Back. About half of these levels are vehicle or water, and the worst of these are the Coco levels on the jet ski. The hidden level Hot Coco is especially tough since its non-linear path forces you to think for a second, which I try to avoid at all costs. That, combined with mazes created by bombs and narrow jumps between nitro crates, makes for a miserable time trial. The water levels are annoying like usual, and the bike levels can be tedious because a single mistake costs you the race. But once you've mastered the mechanics, none of the other ones really stand out. Honestly, some of these stages can be tough, but nothing compares to the hardest levels of the first two games. The introductions of time trials are the only roadblock to an easy 100%. Whoa! Right up next is the Insane Trilogy version of Crash Warped. I personally prefer the look and feel of the remastered trilogy compared to their PS1 counterparts. But despite being more comfortable on this version of Crash 3, I find it harder for two reasons. Jet ski controls, and the DLC level, Future Tense. I don't know what changes Vicarious Visions made here, but the jet ski feels all over the place now. Now granted, I was trash on the jet ski for the PS1, so even if it's only slightly worse, it makes all the difference for me. As far as Crash's normal controls go, there isn't much of a difference here, so the rest of the levels feel about the same in difficulty. That's where the inclusion of Future Tense gives this version the slight edge. This level is brutal, and it's the perfect way to test your mettle on the original series. It's the type of level that can drain an hour of your life the first time getting everything, but it's so well designed that you never hate it. Unlike some levels in the series that really should just be deleted, because I thought Crash was a platformer and not the inspiration for Wii Sports Resort. While Future Tense and Stormy Ascent for Crash 1 aren't technically required for the Platinum, they each add to in-game percentage, so I'm going to take them into consideration for this list. Whoa! Back to where everything started. The original Crash Bandicoot remains as not only one of the hardest games in the series, but one of the hardest platformers ever made. Obviously, plenty of titles like Celeste or Super Meat Boy can be far more challenging than this relic from 1996. But for the casual gamer who's used to games like Mario Odyssey or Penny's Big Breakaway, Crash Bandicoot still has its teeth. What makes the first game stand out from the rest is the process of getting each gem in the game. Like every other Crash game, you have to break every box to get the gems. However, here you have to do it all without dying. That means a single death is a forced restart if you're looking for completion. What's worse is, the game doesn't ever tell you this. Normally when you miss a box, you're brought to that iconic screen where we all get to watch Crash suffer abuse for his failure. But if you get every box and happen to have a death in the level, nothing happens. To make matters worse, the game doesn't show you the box counter while playing. I hadn't touched the PS1 version of this in so long, so when I played it for this video, I was genuinely confused why I didn't get the gem after the first level. That small change makes a huge difference in completion. Trying to beat later levels like Jaws of Darkness without dying a single time is a mind-numbing experience, and it's almost worse than a time trial because you have to take the time to break every box on the way. The level I was most worried about when coming back to this game was the Road to Nowhere. I loathed the time trial for this in the remastered version, so I was expecting it to be a nightmare on the original, with controls I'm not used to. Surprisingly, I found the opposite to be the case. The physics in the Insane Trilogy are most similar to Crash Bandicoot 2. So certain levels, like the Road to Nowhere, are actually easier on the PS1. Whoa! If the Insane controls are based off of Crash 2, why would this version be so much higher on the list? The answer lies in one power-up that was never meant to be included. The speed shoes are originally from Crash Warped, but are unlocked here after beating Cortex at the end of the game. This makes the inclusion of time trials even worse, since the levels weren't designed to run at this speed. Crash 2 has some of the hardest levels in the trilogy, so adding in speed boots for time trials makes things so much more difficult. And that's not even taking the polar levels into consideration. The secret level Totally Bare takes place at night, and getting the gold relic sucks because you can't see what's coming next, and you have to stay at max speed almost the whole time. The only saving grace is that the cycles stay consistent, so you can always know where to jump. Not that that helps until you've memorized the whole level, but at least it's something. Whoa! Crash Bandicoot on the PS1 feels like a completely different game to its Insane counterpart. Sure, the levels are the same, but the polished graphics and the addition of auto-saving and box counters makes this a much more appealing version to me. It's definitely not easier though. To keep things consistent between games in the Insane trilogy, you no longer need to break every box without dying. But the Tawna, Brio, and Cortex bonus stages are now required for every gym, unlike the original. This makes things much less repetitive, since you already need to beat the level without dying for the time trial. And it adds some new challenges for completion not present in the first game. It's absolutely heartbreaking when you accidentally spin away that final token. As I mentioned earlier, the controls here are significantly different from the original, and that becomes especially clear when you're trying to speed run through the levels. Some spots like those turtles don't cooperate with these new physics, and makes every jump way tighter than they were intended. And then there's Stormy Ascent, the level that Naughty Dog cut from the PS1 because it was too difficult. And they were right. This is easily the hardest level in the trilogy, and trying to beat it without 20 plus lives is a mistake. With a little patience, the gym shouldn't take too long to get. There's plenty of checkpoints spread throughout the level, so you can learn the patterns of the moving platforms before making your jump. But that doesn't help you for the time trial. A small mistake or hesitation can cause the platform cycles to get out of sync, and if you don't do everything the same way each time, you end up having to either wait on platforms to get back in place, or miss your jump in hopes of beating that required time for the relic. Getting the gold relic here for Stormy Ascent took me longer than beating the rest of the game casually. Honestly, Stormy Ascent alone puts the first Crash Bandicoot as the hardest of the trilogy, but this level would be considered average if it was a part of the #1 spot. Whoa! If you've ever gotten 106% in Crash Bandicoot 4, you knew it would be at the top of this list. Beating the game casually is a rewarding experience that any Crash player could finish in about 6 or 7 hours. While the levels in the game are longer than previous titles, most aren't impossibly hard. That's where all of the completionist bullshit puts this game on top. There are 64 levels in the game. Outside of the 5 boss fights, the base 38 levels each have 6 gems to collect. And to make matters worse, the inclusion of inverted stages puts a filter on each level and asks you to collect all 6 gems again. While that sounds like a lot, and it is, it's really only part 1 of completing Crash 4. If you manage to get every gem by collecting Wumpa Fruit, breaking every box, and dying less than 3 times, awesome. Now do it again without dying once. The insanely perfect relics ask the player to beat every level and break every box without a single mistake. That's where the length of these levels go from a great Crash experience to an absolute slog. Many levels will take you over 5 minutes to tediously break every box, only for you to die at the very end and have to do it all over again. Getting the perfect relics here are harder than time trials from any other game. Yet, they're a breeze compared to the platinum relics for Crash 4. That's right. Outside of Crash Entranced on the GBA, this is the only game in the series where you need platinum relics to get full completion. And now they've included purple relics as developer times if you want something even harder to go for. Toys for Bob expects you to memorize every inch of every level if you want to earn the platinum trophy for this game. So many of these levels took hours to beat, either for the platinum or perfect relic, that it's really impossible to pinpoint any single one as the hardest. But here's a few highlights. Bears repeating is horrible to get the perfect relic in, because missing a single box on Polar means restarting the whole thing. Rush Hour is the longest level in the game, taking almost 4 minutes even when speedrunning through for the platinum relic, and it ends with one of the toughest sections, waiting to throw you back to the start if you get hit by a bus. And some of the boxes in Crash 4 are hidden in the worst spots. I don't think I ever would have found this box in Off Balance without pulling up a guide. I do like discovering things for myself, but if you're going to hide boxes like that, I'm not going to waste my time trying to find them. And I haven't even mentioned the flashback tapes. These are the other 21 levels in the game, and they're unlocked by collecting their respective tapes in each of the base game levels. If you thought the platforming in other Crash games were hard, this contains the tightest jumps and tricks he's ever had to perform. Luckily, there's no insanely perfect relic here, so you can die hundreds of times to get every box. And you will die hundreds of times. While the first few tapes are easy, the final ones are the hardest puzzles seen in the series, and require trial and error just to figure out what's going on. Altogether, it took me over 100 hours to get the full 106% in Crash 4. And that's it. I've beaten every Crash game over these past few years, and my journey is finished. At least until they release Crash 5 in another 10 years. If you made it this far in the video, you must like platformers. I've spent a lot of time talking about the hardest Crash games, but I'd love to hear what you think the hardest platformer is in the comments below. Till next time, thanks for watching.